you can see here. And in almost in 3 directions, 2.5 directions, you actually have the fort is surrounded uh, by land that looks like this, or should I say that once looked like this. Now you will notice straight away that uh, these pictures are from August 2005, but what you'll notice is that the entire land is inhabited by Vilaiti kikar or Prosopis juliflora, which was a legacy of the fact that an earlier Maharaja, Maharaja Umed Singh in the 1930s, was told by somebody that if he wanted to green his desert kingdom, there was this magical tree from Central and South America called Prosopis juliflora, which didn't seem to need good soil, didn't seem to need moisture in its root zone, would grow hardily anywhere, and it would certainly grow in the desert. And Maharaja Umed Singh, we used to fly his own airplane. I imagine him going up in an airplane and literally broadcasting seed from hundreds of bags of seed that he had procured from Kew Gardens in England. And for this reason, this particular land that lay next to Menangar Fort, but not only this land, a huge chunk of what used to be Jodhpur state, which extended all the way to the boundaries of what is Gujarat today, was infested by Prosopis juliflora. Now, this is a photograph of another part of the land that lies next to Menangar Fort. And you can see, if I use my red pointer, sorry, you can see the old city wall on the crest of this hill, which actually is the boundaries of what later was to become Jodhpur Park. Now, I had done a little bit of work for the Mehrangarh Museum Trust in a place called Nagaur, which is about 110 kilometers away. And the CEO of the Mehrangarh Museum Trust, which looks after all this land and looks after the fort as a museum, brought me to this land in 2005. And he said, Pradeep, would you be willing to green this area for us? And I took one look at it and took in the fact that there was all of this Prosopis rampant. I also had to take in the fact that it was, the entire area was rocky. And it was rocky not with a soft rock like sandstone, but with a rock called rhyolite, which is every bit as hard, probably harder than granite is. And therefore, my first reaction when I saw it was to gulp rather hard and say, look, it's a magnificent site. It will be a wonderful project. But what exactly do you mean by greening it? Because if by greening this site, you mean that you want to have lawns and flowering trees and to make it pretty like a park, are you willing to, first of all, bring in several million tons of soil from outside? And are you willing to water and give nutrients to the new plants that you plant here every single day for the rest of your life? Because after all, you are in a semi-desert. And the CEO listened to this and he said, well, when you put it like that, then maybe that's not what we want. What do you suggest we can do? And I said, well, it seems to me that the obvious way to tackle this is to try and restore the natural ecology of the desert. First of all, by removing the Prosopis juliflora entirely, and then looking for plants that are going to survive in here in these conditions without needing any further assistance. That is to say, without being watered and given nutrients later. And he was somewhat skeptical. He asked me to write a small proposal, which I did. This proposal was circulated among the members of the trust, who gave me a kind of provisional go-ahead. And I suspect the understanding was that they would try this out for a few years and see what was going to go on. Now, I'm going to I'm going to tell the story in in a very concise form because it's actually quite a long story. But for us, first of all, taking out the precipice itself was a huge issue, partly because precipice is known to be extremely hardy. If you cut it at the roots, if you cut it at the soil level, it coppices and comes up all over again. We explored several possible different ways of doing it. All those ways seemed, for one reason or the other, I mean, you can use toxic chemicals, right, to go that will penetrate into the root zone. But all of this land drained into places where water collected and was used by the people. So there was no question of using anything toxic. There was no question of using mechanical diggers because partly because the land itself wouldn't allow these vehicles to to navigate the land, but also it would ruin the land in many places. And for us, this was, it was made clear by the CEO that this was the heritage landscape of the fort, and they didn't want it ruined. We could have used dynamite, but same problem. We would have actually ruined the land. So for a number of, and then there was another set of suggestions which I call the cockeyed suggestions, which was, on a full moon night, you take, you say a particular mantra and you put cow dung in a particular way and that precipice disappears. Of course, none of that worked. But finally, we used a method that involved a community of traditional miners of Marwar. We were extremely skeptical that this would work because the traditional building stone, the stone that is used and worked, to a high degree in Jodhpur, is a sandstone, which compared to rhyolite is a very soft stone. So I didn't think that the traditional miners would have the skills or the ability to actually cut down into precipice. And we had discovered that in order to get rid of precipice, you had to go down at least 2.5 feet below the soil, because up to that point, the roots had budding zones. It would just recoppice if you cut anywhere before that. So we asked these people whether they had the ability to cut down to 2.5 feet in rhyolite. And the gentleman whose picture is at the bottom right, Dhan Singh, was completely confident. And we, to cut a long story short, we hired them. We were satisfied that they could do the job. And eventually they stayed with us for 7 years, literally taking out tree by tree, plot by plot, until they had done the entire 70 hectares of the Rajudha Park. Now, this is them at work, and you can see that they're basically using extremely heavy hammers and chisels and nothing else. And that's why it took as long as it did, 7 years, before we were finally rid of precipice in the park. Now, I'm going to very quickly try and give you a pictorial sense of progression, how we moved from a situation where we were infested with precipice uh, till today. So it's a quick rehash of how the park changed. You can see in the picture at the bottom right that the precipice is being removed. There's a horrible moment when the precipice goes. The new pits have not yet sprouted to any large extent, and the land looks extremely barren, right? But you can see in these pictures again that see here basically what's happened is that in the picture on the top, the lower contours near the lake, the precipice has been removed in the bottom picture, and you can see little burnt patches where some of the precipice, the straggling sticks have been burnt, and then they were planted up. So again, we're talking about very, very early days. And this is what we're getting. We're getting an early stage around 2008, where you're seeing a bit of green, but most of that green is probably ephemeral plants that come up in the rains and then die down by December. You've got some grasses. You're barely seeing, you have to remember that we are growing plants in a nursery. So the plants, especially in the first year or two, are really small when they're going into the ground, right? By 2009, you're beginning to see more. By 10, you're seeing much more. So this is now 4 years into the restoration work. 2011 and 14, these next two pictures give you a much better sense of how this particular patch of land is being restored. You can see 3 tall sticks of neem, which is very interesting because the neem was actually there even when the precipice was there. But the precipice it secretes an alkaloid in its root zone, which suppresses plants. And these neem trees were only about 3 or 4 feet tall as long as the precipice was there. But the minute the precipice was removed, they shot up to about 17, 18 feet within the first year. But then the minute that the lake expanded and its waters actually reached its root zone, the neem said, this place is not for me. Neem can't stand water in its root zone at all. All right, the next 2 pictures give you a sense of how much closer to today the land is now beginning to come back. There is much more success with the kinds of plants that we're using. We've learned a lot more about what's working, what's not working. And finally, in 2019, viewed from one angle, this is now what this particular part of the park looks like. And then from another angle, this picture was taken during the lockdown, where you can actually see that, all those areas that had precipice have now bounced back with a different kind of plant. There's one thing that I forgot to tell you, and that was that one of the decisions we took very early on was that precipice had actually told us where it was possible for a tree to grow in this extremely hostile environment. So the strategy was that wherever the Khandwalia miners took out the precipice, took out the Marwari name for precipice is Bavlia. So wherever they took out the Bavlia from, that became an opportunity in which we were going to plant something new. So we were actually replicating the places where precipice was growing. Now, just to show you the same progression from a slightly different angle, these are 3 pictures from 5, 7, and 2020, showing you how this particular set of rhyolite tekras became restored. Looking at the fort from the west, another set of pictures. The picture in the middle looks extremely green, but actually you're looking at Cleome, which is a short-lived ephemeral plant that comes up. It's the first plant that actually germinates when the rains come, and it's gone by October or November. So it's a very ephemeral, it's a very short-lived sort of green. And then the picture on the bottom right shows you a much more recent picture. And this is what that angle looks like in 2020. And finally, this is a picture of the western part of JODHPUR Park in the dry season. So even when you don't really have green grasses, in your substrate, you've got this kind of look to JODHPUR Park. Now, this is where I come to what I regard as the heart of, sorry, why have I suddenly becomes, excuse me. Yeah, this is where this is for me the heart of what I want to convey to landscape architects, based on the experience of having worked in JODHPUR Park for 15 years, right? These five sets of these 5 headings encapsulate really what I want to say to you today. Now, under the heading of getting to know your site, obviously one of the first things you need to do is you need to understand all you can about the climate, the rainfall, the moisture, and so on. I've put them here in a different color because I don't intend to discuss them. This is something that anybody will tell you you have to do, no matter how small or big your site, if you want to work with native plants, right? For me, perhaps the single most important lesson, or the most important thing I want to tell you about is the necessity of finding a good analog. When you start to work in a wild, if your intention is to try and recreate a certain kind of wilderness in a degraded site, the most important thing you can do is to try and look for a site that matches your site and that has all the ingredients that you aim at, that you aim for. In the talk that Divya and Shankar gave a few days ago, they used the term a benchmark site when they're looking to rewild in a rainforest. Now, a benchmark and an analog are similar, except that I want to make the point that it's really important that your analog site has, is totally matching your site. That is to say, not just in terms of the moisture regime, not just in terms of the subsoil geology, but if you want to use it as a model, it needs to actually be extremely similar to your site in all its ingredients. That's when you are able to actually look at it and say, look, here is now a ripe wilderness that we can actually try and emulate, right? If you find that for example, the soil or the pH or the geology is different, then you're not doing a good job. You're not going to get the kind of understanding that you need to develop your site. But so that's the first point. The first point is, when you're given a site, especially if it's a large site, you need to go around and look for something that is wild or semi-wild, that is a good analog, a good analogy for your kind of site. All right. You then need to derive a native plant suite. Now, the reason this is more complex than it seems is that, for example, if you take a place like Delhi, if you were to look merely at a flora of Delhi and try and derive a native plant suite from a flora of Delhi, what you'd get is basically a phylogenetic list of plants arranged by families, and it would include everything that you find in every kind of niche and every kind of microhabitat that Delhi has. You'd find plants listed that were ephemeral plants that came up in monsoon ponds and clay, very clay kind of soils. You'd get plants that grow only on the ridge. You'd get plants that are arranged along avenues and perhaps exotics that have been planted there. So how do you actually, derive a native plant suite is something that requires a lot of effort and a lot of careful sifting through floras. One of the problems of floras is that, even though we now have several district floras, district level floras, you have to be very, very careful about making sure that you've got a list of plants that applies to your particular soil and your particular, all the characteristics of your land, right? This is not easy to do, but you need to find a way of doing that. Local knowledge can sometimes help. If you talk to local people, often, especially if it's the kind of site where farming happens or any kind of agriculture, people will have a lot to say about the soil type and what grows there and the kind of things that you can expect to find. You need to be careful about invasives and exotics when you're deriving a native plant suite. There's no point actually having a plant suite for a Delhi place, for example, that includes all the exotics that you have here, right? You also need to look around for what might be missing. So, for example, if I was to be asked to make a plant list for a wild site in, let's say, the ridge on Delhi, there are trees that have disappeared from the ridge. And the only way to understand that is to look, again, to look for wild sites that perhaps are less disturbed, less close to a city, and try and find trees, try and look for trees that may once have existed in this particular ecology. So in the case of the ridge, for example, I would travel a little south along the Aravallis, looking with great interest at what still exists, especially uh, where a hill is not disturbed to any great degree, right? And the other interesting source of materials might be historical paintings, historical photographs. When we were working in Jodhpur, we tried to look at old photographs and old paintings, and we found these two paintings on the left by somebody called Charles Lamb from the 1890s. And we actually didn't find a lot of useful information there. We could see that especially in the picture at the bottom, you see these cactus-like euphorbias, which must have caught the imagination of the artist. And you can just about make out the calotropis, the acro at the bottom, but everything else seemed like it was just generic green stuff without being, something that you could actually identify. So it turned out in this particular case that it wasn't useful for us to look at. But very often, if your site is the kind of place where you might have old pictures, it can be very, very useful. Tracking land use is obviously extremely useful if you're looking at a chunk of land. Has your land been used for agriculture? Has it been used for mining? Has it been used for, if the land has been used for agriculture, the chances are that you've got a lot, it's been drenched with chemical fertilizers perhaps, or with pesticides, in which case you're going to have to do some amending. So the way in which your land has been used in the past is clearly very, very important to what you might be doing. It affects what your topsoil is like. And there's a whole lot of cascading effects that you need to look at there. When we were working in Jaipur on a site, which is a site where a lot of sand had blown into the base of a hill, we were curious to know whether the sand had was that sand actually transported by the wind, or was there a possibility that the sand had been brought there by flowing water? And we met a very interesting geologist who said, look, it's very easy to tell. You just give me the grains of sand and we put them under a microscope. And if the grains of quartz actually have angular edges, that will suggest that they've been blown here. But if they're rounded, then they will be something that has been brought by water. So you can actually tell whether transported soils, and especially quartz grains, have been brought by flowing water or by the wind, right? And obviously you need to look at disturbance, because disturbance and the ways in which your site has been disturbed will tell you a lot, it will yield a lot of interesting information that you can use when you're planning to restore your land. I always say that it's important to characterize your landscape. And the next slide is only partly tongue-in-cheek. I created all these binaries just to give you a sense that, it's very, very interesting to try and characterize your landscape in terms of what it is and what it isn't. And if you use binaries, you can actually land up with a lot of very, very interesting, what you typically do is you'd use a series of binaries to describe your land. I'm going to leave the slide on just for a few seconds while you absorb it. But this is something that I used when I was talking to forest officers in Jaipur when we were lecturing, and they had a lot of fun with these ideas. One reason why it's important to characterize your landscape is that people tend to think in fairly large general terms. But even if you look at something like the desert, there are many, many different kinds of desert landscapes. You know, in these pictures alone, for example, you can see one site that is a marble mine. You can see another one which has got iron-rich gravel at the base of a Jurassic hill. You can see another place which is calcrete, which is basically calcium that has been deposited there from a lagoon, you know, in the sea. There are quartzite sites, there are clay sites near water. There are the site on the bottom right, which looks like a series of circles with a pink center, is actually a salty site in Sambar Lake. You've got ferruginous sandstone, you've got other kinds of sandstone, you've got migmatite, you've got granite. So the desert is full of different types and subtypes of landscapes. And it's really important when you're given a site that you assign it not just characteristics in terms of binaries, but also you hunt down the particular subtype of what kind of site it is. Now, starting your own nursery, I'm not going to spend too much time here. It's pretty obvious why you will need to do this. Simply, you will find that most plants, most native plants, if you've made a good list, are not readily available with nurseries that are operating. We're beginning to get a couple of native plant nurseries happening. I know that southern India, several places now, you've got some excellent native plant nurseries, especially in the tropical dry evergreen forest around Auroville and Tamil Nadu. Several friends in Delhi have started in a small scale native plant nurseries, and I'm pinning my hopes on these nurseries becoming quite important. But I've found that almost wherever I'm working, whether it's up in the hills, whether it's in the desert, whether it's in Delhi, whether it's in Madhya Pradesh, this is one of the first things you need to do, because you're not going to be able to find a sufficient number of plants that that will represent your biome if you rely on existing nurseries. The other reason to start your own nursery is to stay true. Now, what I mean by staying true is that very often you'll get a species of tree, for example, or a species of a bush that has several subspecies. Now, there's no point bringing in a subspecies from another region unknowingly when it should be possible for you to grow the right subspecies by finding that subspecies on your land. So it's quite important to stay true to the kinds of to the kinds of plants that you have in your biome. And also there are biosafety reasons. I mean, very often you can be bringing in disease, you can be bringing in certain weaknesses by bringing in plants from other places. So it's really important to start your own nursery. In order to start your own nurseries, obviously you need to collect seeds. You need to understand what the right time of the year is to collect seeds. With trees, it's very simple. With trees in a dry deciduous climate or in the desert, there's only one time when trees produce seeds, and that is close to the monsoon, because that's the only time when the ripe seeds have a chance of actually germinating. With ephemerals and with smaller plants, they don't need to necessarily work with that rhythm. With ephemerals, with things that come up only in the rains, they're usually dropping their seeds by November, December, sometimes as late as January. And this is true even more so of grasses. And please remember that trees are only one part of the plant, of the plants that you need on your land. Too often you hear, state governments, the Delhi government says, we want to plant 2 million trees this year. But what about shrubs? And what about grasses? And what about small things? I mean, it's, a habitat that is only trees is extremely incomplete, right? Now, when you find that you're actually are starting your own nursery, it's quite important for you to keep careful records and journals, because very often the information that is needed to grow plants successfully is not available. So you actually need to keep your own records to record when you're planting things, to understand perhaps why something is not happening so that you can correct it the next year, and so on. And planting out. Now, I want to share with you something that happened to us in Jodhpur Park in Jodhpur. When we first started planting out, 2006 and part of 2007, this picture, you're seeing a landscape that's been, where precipice has been removed in large parts. Most of the green that you're seeing is not necessarily plants that we've put in from a nursery. You're seeing lots of ephemerals, lots of plants that have just come up on their own in the rains, the plants that are not going to last very long. But when we started to track how the plants were doing, the plants we'd actually put into this landscape, we found that we were getting something like 60, sometimes 65% survival rates. And this was, in a sense, not surprising, because we, the ecological information that is required to plant correctly in this landscape, in this biome, is simply not available. If you look at a flora, you look at Bhandari Saab's, book about the flora of the Indian desert, there is almost no ecological information. It's merely a description of the plant, right? So we said, how can we possibly gain more information about what plant works best within this landscape? And what we decided to do was to number every single pit, to measure the depth of every single pit. We were varying the soil mix that we were using. So we would record the particular kind of soil mix that was going in, and we would record the identity of the plant, the species that was being put into that pit, and we would try and describe the site quality. And when we did this regularly, we got this kind of pit reporting. That is to say, a particular pit number, we would describe the site quality, how deep it was, what percentage of clay there was in the soil mix, which species was put in, and then we'd have some sort of comments about how the plant was doing. And at the end of the day, if you used an Excel sheet and you put, let's say, all the boardies together by arranging a particular, picking a particular column and putting them together, you started to see, not everywhere, but you started to see patterns of how some plants required some things more than others do. And this is really what helped us a great deal in beginning to understand that, even within one particular kind of rhyolite landscape, there are little niches that appeal to some plants more than others. And unless you actually understand this and begin to use that information, you're going to have a much larger degree of lack of success. All right, then looking for clues and patterns is all about becoming so utterly familiar with your land or your landscape that things start falling into place. It's almost as if, when you first meet a new ecology, it can seem, it can seem strange and unfamiliar and sort of chaotic. And then as you get to know it more and more, things begin to fall into place and you start to see patterns where you didn't see patterns earlier. So obviously the soil is critically important to you, and you begin to understand aspects of soil depth, soil chemistry, soil moisture, and mycorrhiza. Now, I mentioned mycorrhiza last week when we were talking with Divya and Shankar. And I want to say that there's this incredible book by, gosh, I've forgotten his name now, Merlin Sheldrake, and it's called Entangled Life. And it's about the modern, he himself is a scientist working with fungi, working with mycelia. And it's about, he presents the modern understanding of how important fungi are to all aspects of plants, not just in the forest, but everywhere. And I suspect that over the next few years, we are going to actually shift our attention dramatically to what is happening under the soil at a microbial level. And until we actually gain this understanding, we're going to be, blundering around like people who don't really know what we're doing. So I just want to say that I don't actually have that understanding myself yet. Something strange happened to me. I was once returning from Jodhpur by train, and I was sitting in my railway compartment, and there was a gentleman sitting opposite me, and he said, um, आप क्या करते हैं? And I said, साहब मैं माली हूँ. And he said, नहीं नहीं आप माली नहीं हो सकते हैं. So I said, क्यों? He said, आपके पास एक इतना बड़ा कैमरा, ऐसे माली के पास कैमरा नहीं हो सकता क्या? He said, नहीं. Then he said, मैं भी माली हूँ. So I said, really, what do you do? It turns out that he was a scientist who had discovered a particular mycorrhizal plant, a mycorrhizal fungus in the desert. And he explained to me, he said that, basically what mycorrhiza do is that mycorrhiza are able to access food, that are otherwise unavailable to plant roots. So for example, food may be locked up in minerals, but the fungi can get to it and provide it to the plants in exchange for sugars and other food from the plant. So there's a wonderful symbiotic relationship. And I think that what the point that Merlin Sheldrake is making, very, very forcefully, is that we really need to understand now what is happening at the root level to really advance our understanding of how plants work. Now, coming to plant density. One of the mistakes I think that people make is they assume that to make a beautiful wild habitat, you just need to pack a place into a dense woodland. There's a particular biodiversity park in Delhi, in the Vasant Kunj area, where if you were to visit it, you would be appalled at how a dense woodland has been created, when in fact the natural ridge ecology is one of an open forest. It's not a dense woodland at all. So it's quite important for you to understand again, going back to your analog, it's very important to understand from your analog, from your benchmark forest, how trees arrange themselves in relation to each other, how particular species can form communities, and how you have particular niches. For example, one of the niches that we discovered was critically important in the desert, in Jodhpur, in this rocky habitat, were tiny cracks between rocks. And the reason they were so important was that if you think about it, when you have two rocks close together like this, and you have a crack in between, any soil, any airborne soil that falls into this crack is protected from drying out, from being desiccated by the sun and by the wind. And therefore you can actually have a narrow crack that remains moist well into the summer until the rains come again. And we've actually seen this. We've excavated plant roots and seen this, until we were completely stupefied by how amazing it is. And I discovered later that they call them chasmophytes. There's a term for them. Chasmophytes are plants that grow in chasms, but in this case, tiny little cracks rather than chasms. The important issue is this whole issue of deciduous trees versus evergreen trees. And I find that that landscape architects working in Delhi, for example, have a huge leaning towards wanting to plant evergreen trees, sometimes because they say that this is what clients want, but it's often because they themselves think that an evergreen tree is a more beautiful tree or is a more attractive tree. Now, the interesting thing is that if you think about it, the natural ecology of a place like Delhi, or in fact of any place that is in the dry deciduous zone, which is a huge zone in central and northern India, you get basically one pulse of rain in the monsoon, right? And after 4 or 5 months of the rain, when there's been no more rain at all for the tree, the natural thing is for the tree to actually become dormant and to kind of shut down all its metabolic uh, processes in order to survive. In other words, being deciduous is an appropriate ecological response to being in a monsoon climate. And therefore, to have an evergreen tree in a dry deciduous zone is actually to walk uphill, is to be doing something very difficult. And I've noticed that, for example, one of the things that you see again and again, especially with, say, airport landscaping, is a kind of imitation of what you see in Dubai, you know, or in Sharjah. I imagine. I haven't been to Sharjah or Dubai. And these are because they want evergreen trees there. They want palms there, you know. So this is something that you actually need to be very careful about. I want to show you a picture that explains what resource sharing is, which is the next point I want to make. This is a photograph of the Thar Desert, way out in Jaisalmer district. And every single one of these trees that you see here is a khejuri tree. Khejuri is called the Jhand in Delhi and in the Punjab. And the khejuri is one tree that has extremely deep roots and manages to survive in deep sand. But why do you think all these trees are so widely spaced apart? The reason is simply this, that they're living in a place where the soil is very poor in nutrients. There's very little biological matter. There's, you know, and therefore, unless the trees are spaced apart, they wouldn't be able to survive. So it's very important. What I'm trying to say is I want to reinforce the idea that if the natural form of a forest is an open forest, it doesn't make sense for you to try and create a dense woodland, right? The picture on the bottom shows not khejuri trees, but a different plant called the pogue, also from Western Rajasthan. And here too, you can see how the plants are clumping and arranging themselves and probably looking for little areas where they can find the nutrients that they want. All right. Now, plant ecology. As you become more and more au fait with your biome, with your landscape, with the ecology of your place, you will begin to see that the trees, the plants themselves are very eloquent about the soils they grow in. And I'm going to give you some examples. You take a plant like the thor, which is the euphorbia that we get a lot of in Jodhpur, for example. Now, anybody who knows the thor knows that the thor lives in a rocky substrate. So even if you see the thor growing as it is in the picture on the bottom right, in what looks like a sandy place, you can bet your last dollar that it's actually got rocks very, very close under the surface. So the thor speaks about the fact that it likes to grow in rocky places. Similarly, plant after plant, if you look at the anatomy of a hillside, now, this picture was taken, I think, in Ranthambore, and you can see that there are very clear zones in which the plants arrange themselves. You get salai right at the top, where my red pointer is. You're getting a grassy area where nothing else will grow just below that. You're getting vertical quartzite rocks only with the euphorbia, with the thor growing there. Then you get a zone where you've got dhok with Anogenesis pendula growing on this slopey land. Then you get these trees that have no leaves on them, these where you see the architecture very clearly. And this is Lania, which will only grow here at a particular place because it's growing on a slight spur, so there's water collecting behind it. So the plants themselves are extremely eloquent about what kind of soil they're growing in. This is a tree called the Indrok, which we discovered 2 or 3 years after we started working in Rajodha Park. And we discovered that Indrok, wherever Indrok grows, it's an indicator that the soil is full of calcium nodules, and it will not grow outside this kind of soil, right? The babul is an indicator of deep loamy soil. I remember when I was working on the jungle trees of central India, I wanted to find a babul tree growing in a jungle because I didn't want to take a picture of a babul growing in a field because my book was about jungle trees, and I couldn't find babul in the jungle. And I began to doubt that maybe babul is not a wild tree. Maybe it's just something that's, that we've brought in to cultivation. And the more I read about it, the more I realized that no, not true. It is a wild tree. But then why was I not finding babul in the jungle? And then it took me a year and a half to realize that babul had lost its natural ecology, because wherever babul grows, it's like a flag that says, here lies good arable land. And that land had then been taken for agriculture. So all of your jungles, all of your national parks tend to be centered on rocky land that is not good for agriculture, right? So babul in this case had lost its own natural um, ecology. Farash is an indicator of, this is the tamarix, or indicator of salty land. Sueda, even higher degrees of salty land, right? Zygophyllum of iron-rich gravelly soil. So once you get to know your land really well, once you get to know your plants really well, you can actually, it's possible to read the soil from the trees and from the plants and vice versa. And that becomes a really important aspect of working there. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about phenology. It's a big topic, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Phenology basically is the understanding of when things happen, right? So when do plants start to flower? When do they produce their fruit? When do they produce new leaves? When do they start dropping their leaves, and so on? I just want to mention very briefly that one of the most exciting things that I explored when I was working on my jungle trees of central India was looking at the reds and the way reds happen as part of new leaf in the jungle, in a dry deciduous forest. I'm looking at an area bigger than France. The way I defined central India was bigger than the whole country of France. But wherever you went in spring, whenever these trees were coming out in new leaves, they were coming out in some shade of red. And the reason I discovered was that, I mean, there are various theories about why trees do that. But the reason that we eventually homed in on was the fact that insects don't see in the long wavelengths. Insects don't see the reds. And it's insects that are the largest predators of leaves, right? Especially new tender leaves. So trees were growing red leaves because they would be cryptic, they would be hidden, they would be invisible to insects who are their greatest predators. It's one of those wonderful magical aspects in which nature, works so brilliantly. But I've often wondered why landscape architects in India, for example, don't use the reds to paint a landscape, to actually use the reds as a way of signaling spring and to plant, keeping the reds and keeping the cascading effects of red in mind, right? Now, moving to the last item here, which is to discover natural clues, I also want to share with you something that I found very exciting. When I was, I would travel out from Jodhpur several times a year looking for seed, going and visiting some of these analog sites that we had identified in the desert, but also generally exploring the desert. And one thing we found was we found these certain kinds of habitats, usually quite fragmented, quite small, such as the one that you see in front of you, that typified for me particular kinds of shrublands in the desert. And we began to identify three plants in particular. There was something called bui, which you can see in this picture. There's something called keep, which is a much taller green plant, and the sorry, keep, buoy, and Sinio is the third one. And because we didn't have a name for this kind of landscape, we would call it the SBK landscape. And whenever we saw it, we'd exclaim about it. We'd say, "Dekho, SBK dikh raha hai yahan." But why were we seeing such small fragments of it? And we began to ask local people. We said that, look, wherever you see this kind of landscape, do you have a name for it? You know, because we don't see large portions of it. And initially, people didn't quite know what we were asking about. They would give us geographical place names, and we said, no, we're not asking about the name of the place, but this kind of shrubland. Do you have a name? And finally, somebody said, हाँ साहब इसको हम रोई बोलते हैं. Now, here's a case where we had been exploring the desert for several years, and it took several years for this fact to swim into focus, right? We were suddenly beginning to recognize that there is a natural shrubland jungle in the desert that seems to be unrecognized by foresters or anybody else. I've discovered, incidentally, that the name Roi also exists in Punjabi, and except that they pronounce it Rohi, and it means wilderness. But when we first heard the name, I asked some friends of mine to look it up on the net, and they said, look, it's mentioned with Colonel Todd in 1819, traveling by camel from Sindh to Jaisalmer, and he says that the natural jungle of the desert is called Roi. And we were absolutely thrilled because what we suddenly found we were about is that, look, nobody has named the Roi, nobody has labeled it the Roi, but all over the world, in other arid parts of the world, you take the Mulga region from Western Australia, you take the Garrigue in the Mediterranean, you take the Fynbosch in South Africa, or you take parts of California. They all have names for these arid shrublands. And I said, how wonderful if we can actually, you know, inject this word Roi into the vocabulary that people use when they think about the desert or talk about the desert, because it's becoming fragmented. We're losing it. And the best way to conserve it, perhaps, is to give it a name, and that perhaps will help us people to recognize it, to visit it, and perhaps to conserve it. This is another aspect of a Roi. Now here you can see very clearly that you can see the structure of a dune. The structure of a dune means that there are different plants that arrange themselves in different parts of a dune. Right in the center, you can see these care trees, for example, and the care will only grow in what is called the interdune. That is the hard land that lies between two dunes. The closer to that, you get the keep, which will grow also only on a particular edge and a particular windward side of a dune. So this is what I mean by recognizing patterns, understanding your landscape, and being able to, to take that additional step of getting to know it. This picture shows us a plant called Tephrosia falciformis, which is a pioneer. It only comes up when, in the monsoon, when a dune is forming, and as other plants come into the dune, it vacates the land and moves on. And we've tried planting falciformis, and it conforms to this behavior again and again. This is learning that we applied when we were working in Jaipur, trying to create a duney landscape that was reminiscent of the Jaisalmer landscape. And this is the kind of understanding that we use when we were working in Jaipur, in this picture and in the next picture, right? Okay, the last point in this under this heading is Oropitium. Now, here is another thing we discovered for ourselves. Again, we didn't find it in a book. Nobody seems to talk about it. But when we were exploring plant habitats in rocky parts of the desert, we found that there's this particular grass called Oropitium, which looks like nothing much when it's dry like this. It's classified in a lot of books as something that is an annual. It's actually not. And it's not a particularly tall grass or a big grass or a grass that arrests your attention. But if you start paying attention to the way it behaves, it actually tends to live. It tends to live on top of chunks of soil along with liverworts. Liverworts are something that are a little bit like mosses. They're also bryophytes, and they have a symbiotic relationship. But the Oropetium grass and the liverworts play a crucially important role in the desert by actually capping soil and allowing rock to be colonized by soil, which in turn allows the soil to be colonized by plants. And but for this, you would just get bare rock in the desert. So this became a hugely important understanding for us of how we could use Oropetium in the desert. Look at these pictures here. The picture on the right, where you see this deep V of soil. This has only been possible because the Oropetium actually sealed all this soil in, and then the grasses that you're seeing in silhouette on top is actually something else. It's an Aristida that's growing on top of the, on top of the soil that's been kept in there. In the picture on the left, you're seeing a huge boulder that's been colonized by Oropetium. So when we were dressing some of the areas inside the park, we actually were able to take chunks of Oropetium out with the soil, place them on horizontal mats, and then hope that other plants would colonize these mats later, which they did. And I'm only using this to give you one example of getting to know your land so well that you make these kinds of discoveries. Okay, now making amendments. Many of you will have worked on sites where you will want to, for one reason or another, change the quality of the soil, the pH of the soil, the whatever, or the quality of water, or the amount of water you're working with. And I just want to say that it's very interesting to look. See, if you're working on a very small site, this is often possible. The minute you start looking at larger sites, amendments become very, very difficult, because even if you work with, say, chemical ways of altering pH or altering the chemistry of your soil, they tend to revert, and because they tend to be that way for various good reasons. But I want to illustrate this point with water. It seems to be axiomatic with a lot of people that when they're dealing with a dry piece of land, they want to harvest water. They want to make, I think the favorite word that I hear from the mouths of landscape architects is swale. They want to put a swale into every landscape they have. Now, nothing wrong with a swale, but one of the things we learned to do in JODHPUR Park was we started by actually trying to create bunds that would stop water cascading down the hill. But after a while, we began to say, look, when you go out into nature, there are plants growing in places that are far removed from swales, far removed from places where water collects. So isn't it simply a matter of actually understanding which plants will grow where, rather than trying to harvest water in a process that becomes extremely expensive? I mean, if part of what you're doing is, let's say, a village reclamation project where you want to also grow crops, that's another matter. But if you're merely dealing with, in a dry ecology, you don't need to think of harvesting water, provided you can understand which plants belong where. One of the key problems we have when we're training Malis, for example, is that people tend to overwater their plants. And when you overwater, what happens simply is that your roots stay high because the plants don't need to develop their roots to any great depth. And I always say to Malis that it's like spoiling a child by giving him too many sweets and ruining his teeth. They seem to understand this simile, but it's really important that you don't overwater in dry ecologies. Now, I want to talk about two more things here. One is raised beds. Now, when we were traveling in the desert, we often came across plants that grew in different soils, different habitats, that we would want to bring back for our Jodha Park, but we didn't have the right minerals. We didn't have the right soils. We tried in some cases, but we always failed. And we then realized that, perhaps we could, at the back of our visitor center, we had this area that you're seeing here, which was originally supposed to be a car park. And then we said, look, since we're not using the car park very much, why don't we create raised beds for 10 or 12 of these special soils, because that will allow us to grow the plants that we want. And I'm only mentioning this because you can actually have a lot of fun by using raised beds, but it illustrates also how critical particular soils are to particular plants, right? So this is a picture that shows you, I think, 12 separate kinds of soils. What we did essentially was we would go to a particular habitat, we would collect a small amount of soil from under the plant, the kind of soil that was likely to hold discarded seeds from the plant, right? And we would collect that into a empty cement katta. And then we'd bring a little more soil. And if it was a sandy, if the type of habitat or the type of microhabitat was sandy, we'd need a deeper column, because in sand, plants send their roots very deep. So we could actually go under the stone floor. If it was a rocky site, we didn't need much depth. But so we'd fill up the raised bed with the soil, with the appropriate soil, and we'd scatter the seed-bearing soil on top, and we'd wait for the rains. And we had such spectacular results that it was absolutely thrilling. So these are just pictures to show you how well the raised bed worked when we were not able to actually raise these plants at all without their own minerals. And this is something that gave us an idea when we were working in Jaipur. Now in Jaipur, you're working on sand dunes, wanting to grow things that actually happen in Jaisalmer. And what we decided to do was to bring in cement kattas of seed-bearing soil on the same principle. We were not creating big habitats with lots of this kind of soil. We were merely sort of perhaps doing maybe 20 of these cement kattas. Each katta was given, an identification mark, so we knew which particular soil it was. And then, having brought it into the Jaipur dunes, we would scatter it like this. So what you're doing is you're scattering the soil, you're giving the seeds their own minerals, right? So they're not in totally unfamiliar surroundings, and then you're waiting for things to happen. So we had a lot of success doing this in Jaipur, and I just mentioned this as one of the possible ways of working with seed. Now this is the last slide I'm going to talk about with lessons. Sustainability is, I mean, I hardly need to mention this. You can define sustainability in all sorts of different ways. What we meant by sustainability in the Jodhpur context was very simple. We were saying, look, we need to create a landscape that doesn't need to be looked after once the plants are established, right? And this has obviously it has advantages in terms of what it's going to cost. It has advantages in how much work it needs, how many people it's going to, you need to engage to do it, because you can't do it on a large scale. You can do it for a garden that's 1 acre in size, but you can't do it for 70 hectares or 170 acres. You can define it in terms of not needing to water any plants, of not having any sort of toxic materials coming in, and you need to look out for natural reproduction. That is when you know that your landscape is going to look after itself. Wildlife in a restored site is something that that I have worried about a lot. In Rajodha Park in Jodhpur, we actually don't have much wildlife, partly because we have a lot of dogs that are fed by well-meaning people, in Jodhpur who believe that they are, winning points in heaven by feeding dogs and cattle, at the edge of the. So it's very hard to think of having, say, foxes or even ground nesting birds. But I believe that, that a true rewilding will only happen if you have the kind of landscape that is resilient enough to have uh, all kinds of wildlife, including grazing animals within your landscape. And the last point I want to make here is the business of actually having a stakeholder who is convinced entirely of the worth of what you're doing. And I say this not simply to praise the people who I worked with in Jodhpur. I have had a series of failures of trying to work with people who are not totally convinced of why we were offering or why we wanted to rewild something. So it's really important that when you are offering to restore the natural ecology of a place, that the people who own the land or the people who are asking you to do this fully understand and are fully on board with your aims and your objectives, right? This is the very last thing I want to say, that, look, it just is, it's been one of the joys of my life, learning how to read the book of nature. I've done it only, in the desert mostly. I wish I could have done it in many more places, but I'd like to encourage people who are landscape architects in particular to embrace this credo. It's really worth doing. This is where I want to merely mention that this is what's coming up in the next 4 Wednesdays and Saturdays. Vasant Bosco has done incredible work. He's a young man who's worked in these high montane grasslands in the Nilgiris. He's going to be talking next Wednesday. I encourage you all to be there. Aparajita Datta and Nupur Borawke are from the NCF, like Divya and Shankar. And they talk also about the rainforest, but way out in the eastern Himalaya. So quite different from the Anomalais in some ways, but also quite similar in other ways. Paul Blanchflower has done an enormous amount of landscape architecture using native plants from the unique flora that you get in Tamil Nadu because of its double monsoon, and in a part of India that gets the dry evergreen tropical flora. And he'll be very, very interesting. He's going to be talking about the rewilding of several industrial sites that he's worked on. And Suprabha Seshan, Supi Seshan, lives in a community of people who tend the land in several different ways, and they've done wonderful work on their land, which is called the Gurukula Botanic Sanctuary in Wayanad. So I hope all of you will attend these sessions. And now I'm ready to take questions as long as you want to.
Yep, thank you, sir. I would request everyone if you can just type in your questions in the chat box so that one by one we can take the questions.
No questions.
Well, there was a question very initially when you had started presenting. Yes. That people wanted to know why did you go and remove the prosopis? So
why?
Did it have any benefits, or it was just because it was thriving there and growing?
Yeah.
That was one of the questions.
Yeah. So one of the characteristics of Prosopis is that it doesn't tolerate anything else growing close to it, right? Um, when trees do this, it's called allelopathy. It's a way that, I mean, some invasives do it. Some of them do it with alkaloids in the root zone. Other trees do it in different ways. The trouble with Prosopis juliflora is that while in certain areas you can see that local people benefit from the presence of the tree because they can make charcoal from the wood, other people argue that it does provide a little bit of shelter for small animals. Ecologically, it's a terrible tree. You know, no bird nests in it. The leaves are not a fodder. The fruit are eaten by ungulates, and that's basically how it spreads, because the seeds go through the gut, and the stomach acids um, strip the seed coat off the seeds, and that's when they become ready to germinate. But the intention was to create something a lot more beautiful and a lot more interesting and a lot more varied than Prosopis juliflora. That's why we did it.
Okay, thank you. I guess that clears the question, and it's very informative also. There's one question from Mr. Dharmendra that could you concisely tell about your work in Nagaur?
In Nagaur.
Yeah.
All right. So I've done two bits of separate work in Nagaur. When I was first invited to Nagaur in 2004, basically the fort in Nagaur is in the center, and around it is what I call a moat of sand, right? And then you have the walls of the fort. And the moat of sand is actually in terrible shape because, and I'm guessing here that, you know, over the centuries, there must have been moments when the garrison erected some sort of buildings for itself in this moat of sand whenever the fort was laid siege to. So if you were to dig a little bit under the sand, you actually find building rubble. So you had this dreadful sandy soil with almost no nutrients at all surrounding the you know, the mahals in the center. And when I was first contacted by Monty Bana, the CEO of the Meranga Museum Trust, he said, we want to basically we want to plant in this area. And the first time I visited Nagaur, I didn't actually know anything at all about the desert or about desert plants. And I said, look, I think we should use a technique which is well known, which is to to find plants that will thrive in this you know, in this particular landscape with the minimum of fuss. So we looked around us in Nagaur and made a fairly modest conservative estimate of something like 18 or 20 species, which we planted in Nagaur, and they did surprisingly well. And that's really why, it's because we had so much success in Nagaur that the CEO said, look, can I take you to Jodhpur and show you this other piece of land that I want you to green? So that was the first bit of work that I did in Nagaur. Several years later, I think it was 2017, Lady Helen Hamlin was involved in supporting the Meranga Museum Trust in creating in basically creating a garden in one 8-acre or 10-acre plot at the back, in one particular mahal. And she said, Pradeep, I really want you to do this for me. And I said, look, you know, the garden had rectangular plots in it. And I said, Helen, this is not the kind of work I do. I work with wild plants, and I work in, I try and simulate wilderness situations. But you're wanting fairly formal arrangements here. And she said, yeah, but I want you to do it. And I said, I'll do it if you allow me to use wild plants and not not ornamental plants. And she went one better than me. And she said, I'll allow you to use wild plants if you promise me they'll flower in February when it's time for the Sufi festival. And I said, no, I can't do that. I can't do that because plants won't behave like that. And finally, she agreed. So we actually used desert plants as ornamentals in formal arrangements. And it was very, very interesting, but we had to do a lot of testing and a lot of changing because some things just would not adapt either to the conditions in Nagaur or to the, because these gardens were very, very old, there was a layer of dark soil at the bottom that was very different from what we were seeing on the top. And so we had to do a lot of experimenting and a lot of changing. And that was the last thing I did, which ended in 2019.
Okay, thank you. I would ask Vijaya Sur to ask a question, please.
Good evening, sir.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I am from Tamil Nadu. There are
Yes.
some districts in Tamil Nadu like Sivaganga, Ramnad, which are a semi-desert kind of thing. Water
Right.
is very salty,
Yes.
and soil condition is also not very good. So how long it will take to restore this area? If I start a project, how long it will take to restore the area?
See, one of the things that I believe in is that now, I'm so glad you raised this because it's a good point to discuss. I don't believe that if one was to try and restore your area, the area you're talking about, the idea is not to change it. The idea is not to sort of make it less salty or to make it, less dry. The idea is to find the plants that are ideally adapted to growing in those conditions. Because when you look around you, if you were to find an analog in that area, you would probably find places that are thriving with plants, right? Have you traveled a lot in those areas? Yeah. So
Yes.
I mean, in all the traveling that I've done in the Thar Desert, it's amazing that every single kind of micro habitat that you can think of is inhabited with something or the other. So it's just a question of finding what works in that soil, in that moisture regime, in that climate, in that chemistry, really. How long will it take is hard to say. That depends on many different things. But based on the work we've done in Jodhpur, um, it depends partly on when you believe that your work is done or when it's been completely restored. But look, it's been 15 years. I'm very, very happy with the work we've done in Jodhpur in 15 years. And that's probably the kind of time scale. But I've found that working, say, in the lower hills of Garhwal, you can get spectacular results in 2 or 3 years because you get much more rainfall. In the desert, I would say that anything from 12 to 15 years is probably, par for the course.
Okay. Thank
I
you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just wanted to let everyone know that there's a lot of questions which say that if these recordings are available, yes, they will be available on ISOLA website, and we will let you know at the right time. So I would request Valerie to just ask her question, please. Yeah.
Hi, Pradeep. It was
Hi,
a
Valerie.
really wonderful talk. Um, I was just wondering, what is the kind of time and effort it took you to really find your analog sites and understand the plant ecology there? Uh, because that's like one of the first steps in restoration, right? And, how much time and effort do you put into it? And if you're drawing up, plans for a certain site, and if you're drawing timelines, like how much time do you give to that particular task? How do you do it?
So look, it's interesting that for Jodhpur, for the Rao Jodha Park, I never actually found one single analog site that was satisfying in every respect. what I did found were fragments, So I would find one particular fragment that answered one set of requirements, and then I'd find another fragment. But yeah, so whereas working in Jaipur, where we were creating dunes, I was already so familiar with the desert that I knew exactly what I wanted to use as my analog, right? I've been advising a few friends who have started work recently in different places. And, I believe that, I mean, the desert is in some senses an extreme case, right? But if you were working, let's say in Delhi or in, any other city that we can think of in, say, northern or northwestern or central India, finding analogs is actually not very difficult. If somebody's working on the ridge, for example, it's very simple to find an analog by exploring the the Aravalis, right? Timelines is tricky. It depends on how much you can throw at the work. You know, um, obviously you can bite off bigger chunks instead of smaller chunks by putting in more money. But you also don't want to try and bite off more than you can chew. So I mean, there's no standard answer to that question, really. I would say that if you're working on an ecology that is similar to Delhi's, to any of Delhi's microhabitats, right? You're probably talking of something like 6 to 8 years before you can show appreciable results. Then the drier you get from Delhi, the longer it takes, is what I would say. And it becomes shorter if you get into higher rainfall areas.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Can we have Kushal? Can you ask your question, please?
Hi. Yeah, thank you again, sir, for sharing your process and especially the key takeaways to summarize it. I think my question is related to the last two questions. Is we are talking about the long time span and long timeline and the patience needed to go through these projects. How do you buy that patience from the stakeholders or people in the trust in this case, or the funders from the community or something like this? Because to do this at a smaller scale gets even tougher because of the impatient natures of stakeholders in some cases. Like, can you do you have some interesting dialogues that you remember with the stakeholders when you started the project back in 2005? How did that go about? Or were they already at a stage where you can have that dialogue easily?
No, so what I remember very clearly was that when I first proposed to the trust that this is what we wanted to do, I think there was a healthy skepticism amongst the trust, because they hadn't, they couldn't envisage perhaps what the end result was going to be. And I remember Monty Bana saying to me that, look, at the end of 3 years, we will decide whether we want to go on with this. But there was enough, you have to remember we were working plot by plot. So there's a very uneven development of the 70 hectares. We were really, but at the end of 3 years, we've probably worked on no more than about, say, 12 or 13 hectares at the beginning, with the first lot being the most advanced, because that's had all 3 years of growing and developing, whereas the last bit will have had very little. I think they were convinced that there was enough good that was going to come of it, that they weren't spending a huge chunk of money on it, that it wasn't, they were not sort of, and that there was also, yeah, that basically the environs of the fort were being enriched by something that might look very lovely. I think that is what kept it going, right? But to address your question from a different angle, I'm trying to imagine a situation where you have a client who says, look, I want something done in 2 or 3 years and not in 10 or 12 years. I've worked recently with Savita Punde, for example, who is sort of rewilding the insides of a fort, but working very typically like a landscape architect, but using native plants. So it is possible to do this in a different mind space and with a different approach, right? Where you mix in wild plants. See, the thing about wild plants is also that, especially in the desert looks westward. The desert belongs to a flora that it shares with the deserts that stretch all the way into North Africa, right? And so it looks westwards. The rest of India, with the exception of the Himalaya, belongs to a floral region that looks eastwards. It's called the Indo-Malayan flora. The result is that the plants that you see in the desert are unfamiliar to people. So if somebody from Delhi or Bombay or elsewhere visits Jodhpur and sees even what would otherwise be thought of as being weeds, they go, wow, these are interesting. But it's because they're completely unfamiliar to them. So that's something that you can capitalize on, right? And this very often happens with other kinds of wild plants. So there are ways, I think, of, design is ultimately going to be crucial to how you use these plants. If you just have a jumble, I mean, somebody was talking about the Miyawaki forest at the previous talk. I find Miyawaki almost senseless, because what you're doing is you're investing in getting dense woodlands with things growing 2 feet away from each other, competing for light and therefore growing very quickly, but almost without any structure, without any way of arranging themselves in a manner that resembles the way the wilderness looks. I find great beauty in nature. When I look out at, if I go to Kana, if I go to Bandhavgarh, or if I go to, Madhav National Park, I'm struck by how wonderful things are as they are, and that's what I want to try and replicate. I don't want to try and create dense, concatenation that don't look like anything else. Sorry, I've drifted away from what you originally asked, but yeah, no. So I mean, there isn't a way of binding a stakeholder, but except by, um, somebody once asked me whether I would be willing to work on a small plot of land in the Garhwal Himalaya, and we started work, and it failed. It failed for other reasons, not because they didn't believe in it. It failed partly because they didn't have money and stuff like that. But I think the best way of binding a client, or the best way of getting them to commit themselves to supporting a rewilding scheme, is to show them something that works. I think that in some ways, JODHPUR Park has become an exemplar as well. People actually bring clients there and say, this is the kind of thing we want to do. Yeah. And then the clients go, well, all right, if it's worked here, then we know it works. So to actually have a template, to have an example that works. And if this can happen in different kinds of biomes, different kind of ecologies, that works beautifully. And that's what I hope some of you will actually gather from, from all these other people who we have on the show from other parts of India.
Yeah. Now, thank you for leaving such a nice analog for us, for everyone in the future. Appreciate it.
Right. Can I request Disha to please ask her question?
Hello.
Hi.
Yes. My voice is audible, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. So thank you for the wonderful presentation, actually. And my query was a very small one. I just wanted to know whether there are any particular texts or books, literature, anything that you would have found like that you would encourage other people to read upon the landscapes, like desert landscapes of our country, because yeah, we genuinely kind of lack on that kind of a knowledge. So yeah.
No, Disha, so this is the thing that, for me, part of the joy of doing JODHPUR Park was to get to know the desert and to understand aspects of it. Because nothing was available, you know. I would make a nuisance of myself. I mean, for example, I have a friend called Dr. Pranay Lal, who loves his fossils, and he's a chemist, and he knows his rocks. And I would want to know about rocks. So I'd see a rock and I'd want to ring him up. I'd want to send him a picture. And I think the only way is to make a nuisance of yourself with with people who know, and to be inquisitive and to ask questions. But the trouble about the difficulty about this kind of work is that you are sticking your neck out. You are working in areas where there is nothing available. I hope to write a book perhaps one day about the desert, but there are so many areas of India that that we don't know and that we haven't explored and we don't know enough about. But it has to be done, bit by bit. And this is the thing that like even with the ecology of plants, what do plants need? We've barely scratched the surface, and all our floras and all the BSI, the Botanical Survey, and all the work they do, they don't look at ecology, and I don't understand this. I don't understand why they are happy only to do kind of taxonomic work and not actually extend the frontiers of knowledge by studying and understanding the ecology of plants. But whether it's desert soils, whether it's different kinds of microhabitats in the desert, whether it's all the wonderful different rocky kinds of landscape that you get in the desert, there just isn't enough information out there, and especially information that's readily accessible to the layman, so it doesn't exist. I'm sorry to say.
Thank you, sir, for that. Actually, I was actually anxious or intrigued to ask this just because I stay in the same place. So I'm a resident of Jodhpur itself. So yeah, I wanted to like read about it more. So thank you so much, but though for that, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Kapil, is your question related to the same? You raised your hand, so you want to add to what sir is saying?
No, I have some other questions. So can I ask?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for a wonderful presentation. And we are always referring your books, and it's very informative for as a landscape architect. So I have one question. While working with this site, which are there in desert, so while working with this site, the most challenging thing is the water. So what is your how you proceed? Do we have to have a water source while working on this project, or once how you think, like if there is a water source, then only that land has a chances to rebuild itself, or it's a simultaneous process? So you start rebuilding the land, restoring the land, and then water will also, how you think?
No, so some water is needed in the beginning. So what essentially the process that we follow is that we start planting just before the monsoons arrive, right? Hoping that the monsoons, that the plants will get, the newly planted plants will get the benefit of monsoon rains, which are not very copious. We then water those plants till about December. So we're talking about the monsoon ending, let's say in the first week of September or at the end of August. And they continue to be watered at roughly fortnightly intervals till about December. By that time, we assume, or we hope, that these plants are now hardened off and able to survive on their own. Mind you, we're planting plants that we know to be hardy. We know that they exist in the desert where nobody waters them. So there's no reason why we should be wrong. And of course, we are using our experience to plant them in the right places. So now, after this process, when we see a plant that clearly is dying because it requires water, we say, well, it's obviously the wrong plant in the wrong place. So it needs to die and it needs to be replaced with something else that is going to survive without any assistance, because you cannot go around assisting plants, you know, on a scale like that.
Okay, thank you. I
Thank
hope
you,
it
sir.
answers your question. Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
Can I
thank you.
request
Thank you, sir.
Dipani to ask a question, please? Dipani.
I can't hear Dipani.
I think she's logged out. She basically, her question was, do you think we can overcome a construction lobby that is bent on quick plantations?
Can we overcome a construction lobby? I don't know how to take that question. Yeah, look, there will be pulls and pushes that require landscape architects to plant things that give quick results, and that's in the nature of things. Yeah, but if you truly want to do ecological restoration in a dry ecology, it will take time. It's not going to be something that happens quickly. On the other hand, let me just give you one example of, if you travel by road from Jodhpur to Jaisalmer, you have a brilliant road that, I mean, one reason it's brilliant is that it's used by the army. The road is maintained by the army, I think. And along the first stretch of about 70 or 80 kilometers, you get some gentleman from Bali who, as part of a religious duty or a pledge, planted lakhs and lakhs and lakhs of neem trees along the road. And these neem trees are all scrunched inside metal tree guards. And they're miserable, and they're watered on a regular basis by tankers that this gentleman pays for. And he's obviously, you know, doing this for some religious reasons, but it's absolutely, the results are miserable. You feel very sorry for these trees, and you feel sorry for the fact that, you know, when you go further out into the desert, you see the rohida, you see two kinds of jals, you see the kumars, you see a lot of native natural desert trees that would look so splendid as roadside trees, but nobody, not even the forest department, you know, has thought of planting them, putting them in the right place. So the trouble with quick fixes, the trouble with, you know, growing names when they don't belong there, and not doing the right thing is, you know, has its price. So it's crazy that people don't use appropriate plants in the right place. Okay, next question.
Yeah. Can we have Siang Bhutia to ask this question, please?
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, very much.
Hello. Thank you, sir, for the lovely talk. My
Welcome.
question to you is about invasive species. So, what were other invasive species in the landscape apart from Prosopis? Number one.
Uh-huh.
The another question is, do they keep coming back even after the removal? And if yes, then how long do you think this removal of invasive species should continue?
Yeah. So in the habitat in Jodhpur, we had maybe 5 or 6 invasive species, but only one tree that was invasive. So other than Prosopis, the other invasive things were small. I mean, there's lantana, which all of you know, but only to a very small extent. There's something called xanthium, which is a small asteraceous plant that grows next to water. We've had a little bit of subabul coming in as a tree, but very little. So I would say that 95% of all the invasives was actually represented by Prosopis. Prosopis will not come in again if you've done a good job of going down at least 2.5 feet below the ground. And if you don't have ungulates bringing in seeds that have been processed in their stomachs. So basically, unless you have, so if your land is, if you've got walls protecting your land, so we've had absolute generation of precipice, none whatsoever. Other kinds of, something like subabul doesn't need to be, the seeds don't need to travel through the stomachs of another creature. Subabul is incredibly invasive, huge reproductive success, it's much worse than precipice in many ways, and it's the scourge of places like the Delhi, the central region, Delhi, and other places, about which the forest department does nothing, is probably not even aware of it. But as far as your question is concerned, yeah, we've never had a problem again with precipice from an area after it's been cleared.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. Can I request Mukta to ask a question, please? Mukta, you'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi, Pradeep.
Hello.
Hi. Have you used all these grasses and native plants on a podium or a slab? Because most of us, we work on slab. There are very few projects when we work on real ground, basically.
No, I haven't worked with them on a podium at all. No, I haven't. No, if you're working on, if you're not working on the ground, you would have to do some experimentation to see what will work. And I'm sure you'll find things that require very shallow soil as opposed to deep soil things. But as a rule in the desert, if it's sandy, the plants put a huge amount of energy into developing an extremely deep root system, because sand is self-mulching. So if you go down like 4 feet or 4.5 feet, you will often find moisture in sandy soils, and the sand offers so little resistance to the roots that that plants do really well in sandy soils, but they won't certainly do well on a podium. So you'd probably need to look for things that grow in rocky soils and that don't have very deep roots. But the chances are that you then be saddled with ephemeral plants that lead very short lives and that come up in cycles.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask Seema Anthony to ask a question, please?
Thank you, Pradeep, for the great talk and for sharing so much information that you've collected over so many years. It was very informative.
Thank you.
I just wanted to know whether you go back to the sites. I mean, once they're done and you're happy with how the plants have picked up and they're continuing, whether you go back and continue to check on them or continue the learning.
So I mean, I haven't been in the business so long that I've lost touch with things I've done. In fact, I retired from being director of JODHPUR Park in March of last year, just before the lockdown. But the intention was to remain in touch, because I wanted to start writing, first of all, about the work we did in JODHPUR Park, because I think it's important for anybody who wants to plant in desert rock, not having to reinvent the wheel and being able to build on what we've done. So I wanted to write about all the lessons we've learned and all the mistakes we've made. I also wanted to write a field guide to all the plants inside JODHPUR Park, which is about 230, 240 species. So yeah, I've kept in touch with JODHPUR Park and will continue to be in touch with it. Yeah, I haven't lost touch at all with not certainly not with JODHPUR Park.
Thank you.
Yeah, Srinivasan, do you have a question or you wanted to add something? Yeah,
no,
please
I have a
go ahead.
question.
Yeah, please.
Hello, sir. It was wonderful talk. Shini from Animalize. So I was wondering, so Have you come across any infection in your plants while raising your plants in the nursery, or after it go back from nursery to the site? Did you come across any infection? And if yes, then how did you deal with those infections on
Yeah,
plants?
yeah,
Any?
yeah. We have occasionally had problems, yeah, with plants in the nursery. See, there's an enormous amount of plant diseases that are related to, too much moisture.
Yeah, correct.
Right, and we don't have a lot of moisture in our, in our plants or in our ecology, so that's not a huge problem. But we have had problems. We got in touch with a very interesting organization, I think called Srishti in Delhi, or perhaps in Noida, who gave us some natural plant medicines, that we've been using, but we've had very little problem. It's not been a huge problem with us.
Okay.
And we've managed quite well with fairly simple things.
So this infection disease mostly occur when you keep same species together, or like it also you see when you mix those species?
No, for example, you can get damping off, and you can get little bits of sometimes, some fungal stuff, but yeah, you just have to be careful. No, it's not usually been stuff that's transmitted in a big way between plants. We haven't had that kind of problem.
Okay, so sir, other question. So how many species you managed to raise in your nursery?
I think our nursery has something like 130 species of that includes herbaceous things and grasses. But obviously we're talking about perennial grasses and not the seasonal ones. We also collect a lot of seed. So we collect a lot of our seasonal grasses. We collect as seed and then we broadcast.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah. May I request Santosh to ask his question? Santosh, you are around.
Hi, sir. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
Yeah, my question is, what is your take on the Great Green Wall along the southern border of Sahara Desert to prevent desertification? So, like landscape architects take a lot of pride in saying we are designing at a planetary scale. I just wanted to ask if it is a better strategy to prevent desertification. Yeah, thank you.
No, I don't know very much about it, but it doesn't sound at all like it's going to work. I mean, what will a wall do? A wall will probably prevent sand from blowing in, but that's about it. It's not going to change the ecological conditions. But I don't know very much about it. I'm sorry. It's not something that I've read about.
Can we have Somil to take his question? Somil? Okay.
No, can't hear
His
you,
mic
Somil.
isn't working, so I'll read out the question.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about aesthetics when it comes to rewilding a site, especially if one is planning to create an interactive forest with walking paths, seating spaces, etc.? What did you take inspirations from, and did you collaborate with people?
Okay. It's a difficult one to nail down, but yeah, I think that all the inspiration has come by looking at particular places in the wild, by photographing them, by looking at those photographs, later and saying that, let's try and create something that looks like this. So the exemplars have always been wild things. Collaborating, yeah. So I mean, let me give you an example. I mean, working in Jaipur, for example, with the Jaipur Development Authority, was all about working with an architect, my friend Golak Khandwal, and him, giving him photographs of vernacular desert architecture, of rural ways of building huts, and saying like, this is the kind of inspiration we want for our walkways, for our visitor center, for our viewing deck, for our, we call them interpretation islands. So there was a lot of work with an architect who understands and is sympathetic to these ideas. I mean, Golak had also worked with me when we created the visitor center in Jodhpur, which is something I'm also writing about at the moment, in fact. And it's one of the most interesting things we did in Jodhpur was to actually, we were given a 16th century gateway into the city of Jodhpur to work with, and it was in very bad shape when it was first given to us. It was like a ruin. And when I brought my architect friend there, and I said, look, we need to celebrate rock. We need to find ways of reviving this area, but making it into a vibrant place where people can enter, because this is where they will actually first enter Rao Jodha Park. So there was a lot of collaboration with somebody who thinks like an architect, and somebody who was then going to be working with civil works in various ways. Does that answer your question?
It's a yes from Somil. I guess there's one question from it basically says that you had shown some wood walkways with wooden slats or wood used in it. So what is the wood that you used?
Yeah, the wood is babul, which is the one wood in Jaipur that is sold in huge quantities because there is no restrictions on its being cut by farmers. But the way we used wood, and we've used a lot of wood in Jaipur, and the reason what we've done, wherever we've used wood, is we've broken the contact with the ground, because otherwise we'd get termite infestation. So the wood is always raised either on stone or on a metal pipe, so that it doesn't touch the ground. But wood is something I'm deeply interested in. I've done a lot of exploring of different kinds of wood, and especially woods that are unusual woods and not woods that are used, by people like teak and sal and so on, but woods that are often classified as firewoods. And there's an enormous amount of unusual woods in India that people have lost touch with. For example, there's a cirrus wood, which used to be exported to Europe as Indian walnut in the 19th century, and they've stopped doing it. But it's a gorgeous wood, and it's now sold as a fairly cheap, rural wood in markets. And I've used it for my dining table here in Delhi, and I love it. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Do you treat the wood, or
the wood?
How do you convey
so the wood has to be converted into planks, and then it has to be, I season it for a minimum of 15 months, ideally in a basement, in a slightly, if possible, in a slightly moist environment. Because the reason why wood starts splitting and cracking is that while the inside is wet, the outside dries too quickly. So ideally your outside environment needs to be slightly moist. So if you do it right, you get very good results.
Okay, thank you. Can I request Suprabha to ask her question?
Hi, Pradeep.
Hi.
I had a question about climate, and I want to connect it with phenology, which you've mentioned. In the time that you've worked in the desert landscape, have you noticed shifts in climate that might be important for certain groups of plant that, that you're concerned about? And that's a change that we've been noticing a lot in our ecosystem. So just wanted some comments on the annuals and perennials. Do they respond differently to these shifts? Things like that.
I haven't noticed anything in the desert, Supi, but I have noticed things happening here on the ridge in Delhi. But I think you're more likely to find evidence of this when you're dealing with plants on a hillside. You know, that's when you will actually find plants climbing up a hill. You know, because of climate change. But no, I've noticed nothing at all in the desert so far.
Okay, thanks.
And there's a question from Hashim. When trying to restore degraded forest land where there is a little occurrence of exotics, what are your thoughts on simply protecting from heavy grazing and allowing the rootstock to come back and allowing the soil and plants to come up on their own?
Yeah, so very often what happens is that you'll get rootstock that's present. The first part of the question was if there is not a lot of invasives present in the land, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's really important for the invasives to go, because invasives can multiply at a rate of knots. We've seen Subabul entering the central ridge, for example, at a rate of knots, you know. But if you allow Prosopis juliflora, if you allow Subabul to prosper and to replicate it, what happened on the Delhi Ridge will happen to any other land. The Delhi Ridge is reported in the 1920s and 30s by a botanist called Parker as having all its rootstock intact, and it was beginning to regenerate. And then around 1919, 1920, they start to plant Prosopis juliflora on the ridge. And today, the ridge is almost completely devoid of its natural flora. It's only Prosopis. So having rootstock is great if you protect it and if it's not under threat from invasives, right? But if the invasives are allowed to rampage through, a site, the chances are that it will actually spread at the expense of native stuff. The other problem is that when you have only rootstock left, you tend to only have a certain percentage of rootstock left. That is to say, you may have, let us say, 70 species or 80 species of natural trees in a space. You will tend to have rootstock maybe of 30, or of 25, but the others will disappear because they don't have the same degree of resilience. So we've seen this a lot in central India, that you get some trees that will bounce back, but they're a small number. There are a small number of trees that have the resilience to actually, be alive in their rootstock and to come back. But many of them will disappear. So protection is useful and important, but it doesn't give you the full panoply of species that you might want. The other thing is that, rootstock will be there only for trees, really. But really what you want is all the shrubs and all the forbs and all the grasses to come back. And that always suffers if you only protect.
Yeah, I guess Harshvardhan has something to add to the same topic, and his question relates to it. So Harshvardhan, you can ask your question. You will have to unmute yourself, Harshvardhan, please.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are.
Sir, greetings for the day. I would like to ask that, is it a Prosopis juliflora or is it a global warming that our Thar is getting more rain every year?
No, it has nothing at all to do with Prosopis juliflora. I think what you'll find with the rainfall pattern in the Thar is that it's becoming very, very erratic. it's also becoming much more localized. I don't think you'll find that as a whole the rainfall has increased. I mean, last year you had a decent rain. The year before that you had virtually none, you know. So I don't think it's true that the Thar is getting more rain, but certainly Prosperous juliflora will not account for it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think most of the questions are addressed. I would request Aditya to take his question and also conclude the session.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Pradeep. Thank you for a wonderful, informative session. It was so interesting for me, at least. I loved hearing all your insights and learnings. And thank you for sharing those with us. It was wonderful. I have one question before we end, which is just, I'm very interested being a gardener in soil amendment and fertilizer. And as you were speaking, I was just wondering, is it advisable to put a lot of fertilizer in the tree pits and in the desert landscape, just like you don't want to overwater it? So what kind of amendments, ratio of amendments did you mix into the soil mix? We do a third in our tree pits. How do you encourage the trees to grow into the native soil? How do you create topsoil?
Yeah, so what's peculiar about the rocky scape of Rajodhpur Park is that there was hardly any soil, right? So what we're doing essentially is we're saying, look, find the places where, look for Prosopis juliflora, take it out, make a pit where it is. And we were experimenting with 3, sometimes 4 different kinds of soil mixes. But essentially we're using sand that is local. We're using a clay that came out of, so there's a lake at the bottom of Rajodhpur Park, a lake that was, basically it's a water source that was dammed in the 16th century to make water available both for the fort as well as for the city. And that was cleaned 2 years before Rajodhpur Park work started. And something like 55,000 not truckloads, but tractor trolleys of clay came out of that place. So we had a stock of clay that was local, with those minerals, with that soil, that became part of the soil mix. And we were using a little bit of compost. We were also using a little bit of dried gobar, well-rotted manure. And that's it. That's
leaf compost. You just use so a third leaf compost, third maybe a 6 leaf.
The leaf compost and the gobar were basically combined into one thing.
About a third of the soil mix.
Well, that varied a bit. So we varied the constituents to some extent. We used propagules of mycorrhiza that we bought from this gentleman that I met on the train, who first told us about the mycorrhiza.
Trichoderma, do you use trichoderma or?
No, I've forgotten what his one is called, but it's got a trade name as opposed to a scientific name. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you again for a wonderful session. Again, thanking you for creating this series that we're watching and participating in, and we're really enjoying